We're here on April 27, 2000, to interview Judge Robert Varner. The interview is being conducted as part of the Oral History Project of the United States District Court for the Middle District of Alabama, a court on which Judge Varner has served for 29 years, 5 of which he served as Chief Judge. The interview of Judge Varner is being conducted in his federal courthouse chambers by Wally Walker, a former law clerk for Judge Varner and an attorney practicing law in Montgomery, Alabama.
My recollection is that I was born on June 11th in 1921. And I stayed in Montgomery for a few months till they got everybody set up, and then I went on back to Macon County, and I lived in Macon County with my parents all that time.
What was Macon County like when you were growing up in your real early years?
Well, in the real early years, it was, to me, like any other county. We knew a great deal now is talked about the blacks. We didn't think much about the blacks, and they didn't think much about our color as far as I knew. And we were friendly with all of them that I knew, and stayed that way for a long, long time. I played with black children. They played with me. And I played with a lot of white children, too. There wasn't much difference as far as I knew or was aware of for a long time.
Macon County was a small, Tuskegee and Macon County were small back then.
It was, and we didn't do a lot of talking or thinking about the blacks or the whites. We were there, and we served them, and they served us. And we went on from that stage to where there was some differences made. But we didn't become aware of any problems or any differences for a long time. I went to several schools because there were some questions about my needing an education. And those problems about differences in education, insofar as I knew, didn't come up for several years.
Where did you go to school?
Well, I started going to school and to the public schools in Tuskegee. And the schools at that time, all over the South, as far as I knew and as far as I know now, were not different particularly between the blacks and the whites, except that we went to different schools, just as people did all over the South. And I went to the white schools, and they went to the schools that were left to the blacks. That was the way things were run in those days. And very little was said about it as far as I knew. Now, that went on for a number of years. And very little was said about it. Later on, a great deal has been said about it, but I'm not here to talk about those differences. I'm here to talk about the general setup.
Was there a time that you left the public schools and went to prep school?
Yes, sir. Actually, there were a good deal of differences between the schools for whites and the schools for blacks, but nobody knew much about it as far as the children. I remember we had some excellent teachers in the white schools. They had some good teachers in the black schools. I remember Miss Sally Danner was a real great teacher. There were a number of others. She was a teacher of English and a lot of other subjects for that matter. Nice old lady and helpful to everybody she could be helpful to. And I think that can be said about the black teachers in those days. They tried to be helpful to each other and to the other teachers that were assigned to the schools.
And then did you go off to Georgia military prep school?
Well, at first I went to Stark University School, which was a preparatory school here in Montgomery. And looking back on it, I think my parents and grandparents concluded that I needed all the education I could get. And they brought me down here, and I went to school at Stark for 2 years. And then they sent me to Georgia Military Academy, which was a school in Atlanta, or near Atlanta. And I went to school for 2 more years and graduated from Georgia Military Academy. And after that, I was sent to Auburn. And I went to school to at Auburn for several years. And I didn't really know what form of education I was interested in. I was interested to some extent in preparing for a life. And I thought about a dental profession. And I had a great uncle who had a background where he could put me into a dental arrangement. And he wanted to do that, and I didn't know whether I would like to be a dentist or not. And for a year or two, I went to pre-dental school.
When you went to Auburn, your father was the probate judge in Macon County, is that right?
Well, you tie me down. He held several jobs over there. He was at one time he was the mayor of Tuskegee for a while, and for a while he was a legislator from Macon County, and he was, of course, a practicing lawyer over there, and all of that went behind him. At some stage, he set up a situation whereby he was planning to go into a professional position beyond his legal training, and he ran for office, ran for probate judge over there. And at some stage he won that position, and he remained probate judge until well after I had become interested in politics myself. And by that time, some of my friends talked me into running for a job, and I ran for the legislature and got whipped terribly. A little later, I came to Montgomery and practiced law here for several years. And I was still vaguely interested in politics. Somebody talked me into running for the Senate from Montgomery County. And I didn't know much about it, but I decided I would run for the Senate, and because they tried to help guide me. And I spent some time running for the Senate from Montgomery County, and I ran against Joe Goodwin, who was a friend of mine, and I respected him. And he beat me badly again. I lost most of my interest in running for office. And he told me that I was not going to be the sort of politician that had to run for office. Later on, I'd like to say I was talked into seeking another political. I was asked to seek the job of federal judge, and I sought it, and I had a little more fortunate circumstances, and
Right.
I won that job.
But now your grandfather was on the Alabama Supreme Court.
He was, and I really didn't know too much about politics, except that it looked like my forebears were all in office, and I finally got in office myself.
At some point in time at Auburn, you obviously decided you didn't want to become a dentist.
That's right.
Well, let me switch gears with you a little bit and talk about World War II and your military service.
Well, we did have a few years in the service, and I went into the Naval Air Corps, and I served for 4 years as a naval flyer. And, well, that lasted about 4 years. A lot of that time in Honolulu and Guam and Majuro and a lot of small places in the far, well, we now call it the Far East, far West at that time.
One of the persons that you were stationed with, that flew with you and you became a friend of, was Ted Williams.
That's true.
Was he already playing baseball for the Red Sox at the time
yes,
y'all were together?
he had played for. He started making money long before I did. Before I thought of it, thought much of it. But of course, Ted was very successful. He was about to get married before he got into the Air Corps. And he married a little girl from, I've forgotten where, pretty little girl. And I got to know both of them on a friendly basis. And after the war, I continued to be a friend of Ted Williams. He terminated being a friend of that young lady and married another one sooner or later. I didn't get to know his other wife, but she was an attractive, nice lady too. And I didn't see a lot of him. A country lawyer like myself, who practiced first in Tuskegee and later in Montgomery. I just didn't socialize with people that had a lot of money, and I didn't see much of Ted. I did see him, perhaps to my benefit. I went to Washington to see about getting the president to nominate me or try to get me involved in being the representative of this part of the country. And I was interested in the judiciary, so naturally we went in that direction. And it was suggested that maybe the Senate or somebody in Washington would be interested in a job for me. Well, I didn't want to move to Washington, even if I had the opportunity. So I wound up seeking a job and related to the judiciary. And I wound up being a federal judge. Ted Williams was very helpful to me, and I didn't know that Ted would remember me really, except that we were friends and service, and I knew he made a lot of friends. I didn't think about going to see him in Washington, but I did want to see him. I wanted, so I talked my wife and my daughter into going to see the Boston Red Sox play. Ted was playing for the Boston Red Sox. I went down there and I just wanted to see what he looked like and that sort of thing. And I really didn't expect to make his remake his acquaintance. But I knew he had all sorts of friends in Washington. I didn't want to get involved with that crowd. I didn't think they wanted to get involved with me, but I went down and my wife said, well, why don't you sit down there close where you can see him and see what he looks like and that sort of thing. So I asked one of the people there arranging the seating, I said, I wonder if you could put us somewhere down near the front of this thing so that I can see some of the players that I used to know. And he said, well, what players did you know? Well, I named several that I knew were not with the Boston Red Sox, but I named several and that just came to mind, and I didn't want to look like I was putting on airs, but I finally named Ted Williams. He said, well, Ted Williams is manager of the Washington
the Senators.
Senators. Thank you. And he said, we'll put you down there close to them. And I said, well, fine. And few minutes, here he comes. Where is he? Where is he? So I was delighted to see him, and went out and he had the whole family that was up there. At the time, I think Ed was my son. He was now a doctor in Birmingham. Was out of the way. I couldn't get him, take him to Washington. Did take my daughter, and my daughter and my son and my wife all went down and spoke to him, and he said, "I want you to come out to my house tomorrow and have dinner with me. I'm free tomorrow night." And so we went out, and he entertained us, and was very nice to us. And said, "Well, is there anything I can do for you?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to scour up some letters to the President of the United States to get him to nominate me for the Senate." And he said, "Well, I'd be glad to write him a letter." And he did. And I was one of the few judges that got letters from the managers of the Boston Red Sox.
Let's switch gears and go back to after you got out of the service and graduated from Auburn, and then went to law school.
All right. Well, Auburn at that time had no legal training. Was not given legal training. I did go to pre-law school for a little while at Auburn, but that was as far as they would take me. Then I selected the University of Alabama because my father had gone to the University of Alabama and had graduated up there and had pursued legal training. And I went up there, and I completed my legal training at the University of Alabama with a great many more friends that I had in the Naval Air Corps. But we finished there in about 3 years, 2 or 3 years. And not knowing where else to go, I went back to Tuskegee to practice law. And I practiced law over there for 5 years. And finally concluded that probably I'd get along better if I moved to Montgomery and practiced law over here. So I wound up as a Montgomery lawyer as well as a Tuskegee lawyer.
You remember what types of cases you first, or clients that you had when you first went back to Tuskegee?
Well, the people who needed lawyers over there were mostly black people, and I represented mostly black people. I did represent some white people too. I represented anybody who wanted me to represent them, frankly. And that's the way it was while I was in Tuskegee, and that was one thing that caused me to finally move to Montgomery. I was representing nearly all black people, and they were nice people, but they didn't have much money to pay me with. And I was a strange lawyer who liked the idea of making a little money.
What did you do when you first came to Montgomery?
I went to work with Jones, Murray, and Stewart, my legal firm, ultimately. And practiced law for about 13 years with them, and one of the things that I pursued, I ran for the state Senate That didn't do me any good. I couldn't win.
Did you run as a Republican?
I did run as a Republican because by that time I had realized that my political interests were not quite commensurate with the way the Democrats seemed to be going. And so I ran on the Republican side. And just about everybody who was running for office then was running on the Democrat side. And I knew that I might not win, but I could run anyway and establish myself as a Republican, and I did.
Now, before you went into private practice in Montgomery, you worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office as an assistant United States attorney. Was the U.S. Attorney Hartwell Davis?
That's right. And he was an old friend of mine and of the family's. And he said, come on down, I need a first assistant United States attorney. And he took me on. And he taught me what I knew about being the first assistant United States attorney. And I didn't get into much trouble, so I stayed there for about 3 or 4 years.
What types of cases did you prosecute back then?
At that time, he put me on as a criminal prosecutor. And I practiced nearly, well, I practiced both civil and criminal, but most of my work was criminal, because that was the job of the first assistant United States attorney. But both of us, we had only 2 assistants in those days. And both of us had the benefit of practicing on both sides of the thing. Ralph Daughtry, who was the other assistant, was on the civil side. But he and I both practiced both sides.
What type of crimes were being committed back in the mid-50s?
Well, the most noticeable was the crime of making and drinking moonshine whiskey. We did quite a bit of that. We didn't know anything about bootleg wine or that sort of thing. All we knew about was whiskey. Actually, I was prosecuting cases arising from as far south as Dothan and that part of the county, of the state, and as far north as I'd say, well, 2 or 3 counties above, yeah.
Who were the district judges that you practiced in front of when you were assistant U.S. attorney?
One that later became so well known was Frank Johnson, but he was not known of in this part of the state to talk about at that time. Judge Canema was the sole prosecutor, not prosecutor, the sole
Judge.
And he was in charge of every criminal case we had. I was injured. I've forgotten what injured me, but I was not able to get up and make a big show because I had been hurt in one of my frolics. And I spent a bit of my time while I was prosecuting cases not being before the court, but being in the court and without physical ability to get out and make contact. So I wore a back brace, and I got out of the attention of the court except when I said something. When I said something, they looked around for that fellow who was making that noise. And I was that fellow.
You were laying down behind the bench.
I was laying down where I could lie down without causing any problem. And I spent my time, a good deal of my time. And that lasted for several months, but it got me more attention than anything else I think I ever did as prosecuting attorney, except among the bootleggers and some other people of that sort.
After you left the U.S. Attorney's office, you went into private practice with a firm in Montgomery.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
What, just generally, what type of work were you doing?
Well, we did almost what I said I did as a practitioner. I did what I was asked to do. I had what is known as a general practice of law. I had one partner who was generally a banking lawyer. I had another one who was generally a real estate lawyer. The rest of us were wandering around and doing what we could find to do. We had two of my partners were very fine students, and Bob Stewart wound up doing work for people like, what's the name of the?
Hank Williams.
Hank Williams. Hank Williams.
Let's turn to when you came on the bench in about 1971.
I did what they told me to do.
Did you develop an interest or a desire to become a judge, or did someone approach you?
No, I didn't think about being a judge. My grandfather was a judge. He was on the Supreme Court for years, 30 years. I know it was at least 30 years. My father had been a probate judge for 30 years, or nearly that. And I had no desire to be a judge. I was interested, but I wasn't looking for the job.
How did it come about? Did someone approach you, or well, President Nixon nominated you for the judgeship.
That's right.
That's right. Do you remember how you got the nomination?
Well, I got it with a letter from Ted Williams and many other letters. People heard that I was seeking the job, and they were friends, and they thought I'd make a good judge, apparently, and they wrote letters recommending me. That's the way you get to be a federal judge. You get enough letters, you get interest in the situation. I had no interest in being a judge much, but when I started getting letters, I became interested. And finally, there were enough letters so that for the other 5 or 6 people who were seeking the job, I seemed to have more letters.
You remember your confirmation process?
Yeah. I went up to Washington, and I ran into Ted Williams, as I told you about. But that wasn't the only thing. I ran into 2 senators, one from each part of the state of Alabama. And I ran into other people. Now, I knew that one of the senators might be for me, even though he was a Democrat. He knew I was a Republican, but he was a good friend of mine and the family's. The other senator probably had never heard of me. He'd heard of my daddy because my daddy was a good Democrat who probably voted for him as probate judge while he was over there. But anyway, the thing developed. There was a general interest. And after, I won't go through all of the problems that we had, but it took me about 2 years after I began to get interested in the job before I got enough interest so that I felt like I thought I'd have a chance. And after that time, I did have a chance. There were a lot of people that were interested. There were a lot of people who were good people, and they wanted the job, and it went up and down for a long period of time, but ultimately I got the job. But the job was open for about 2 years before I got it.
And then you came on the bench in 1971.
That's right, I believe.
Was Judge Johnson the only other judge when you came on the bench?
Judge Johnson had been nominated and had been selected here, and Judge
Kennemer?
No, Judge Kennemer had passed away, but there was another judge.
Judge Pittman?
What?
Virgil Pittman?
Yeah, Judge Pittman had been judge in another part of Alabama and had been involved in other parts of Alabama. And he said, well, he would help out in another part of Alabama if he could get to look like he'd have a good chance of being appointed from that part. And they said, fine, you're a good man, we'll probably appoint you, but all we can do is guess at this point. But if you take the job for both districts, you might be appointed for the one you really want, which is the Mobile district. So he said, well, I believe I'll take that. So he was appointed as district judge for the middle and the southern district of Alabama. And he held that job until ultimately we got another permanent position for the middle district. That's this district. And at that point, I was given the one for the middle district, and Judge Pittman was given the position for the southern district.
What was it like when you first started as a judge?
Actually, we go back to my bootleg days. We didn't try many drug cases, if any, in those days. We'd have one once in a while, and usually they were picked up from somewhere else or terminated by agreeable terminations. And we didn't really do much of the work with drugs. And of course, today, a great part of our business is drug way.
A little bit and generally about when you came on the bench in the early 70s, and that was a period of time of a lot of civil rights litigation, and if you can, without talking about any specific case, unless you remember it, just talk about that generally, what it was like in that environment to be a judge in this district.
Well, of course, we try a great number of civil rights cases now, and we did try a little bit of civil rights practice in those days, but the general flow of the business has changed tremendously. I would say that the bigger part of the criminal practice and a great part of the civil practice that is derived from civil rights litigation, and primarily it's civil rights of blacks and sometimes of whites today.
What was the political and social environment in the early and mid 70s when you first were a young judge? Or
well, Judge Johnson was appointed as the sole judge, and he was the sole judge here for a number of years, and he was a Democrat when he was appointed. Judge
Pittman
was also a Democrat when he was appointed, and he was appointed by a Democratic judge. Both of our senators were Democrat.
Who were the senators at that time?
Jim Allen was one, and
Sparkman.
what?
Sparkman.
Yes. Okay. John Sparkman was another. And they of course were the only two senators from Alabama for many years. Well, Senator Lister Hill was a prominent senator. All of them were Democrats.
And you were saying that Judge Johnson was the only judge in this district for a while, related to the social and political environment when you came on the bench.
That's right, and that would go for, I think he'd been on the bench for 18 years when I got appointed.
Were you involved in or served on 3-judge panels early in your career?
For a while, but then when I got hurt, I divorced myself from a lot of 3-judge work because of the fact that I just couldn't move about like to. And I never did get appointed on many 3-judge courts after that. And of course, I've been a well man as far as my injury is concerned ever since.
One case I did want to ask you about was the prison case that, as I understand it, you inherited that case. It had already been litigated to some extent when you took over.
I did.
Tell us a little bit about how
well, there was a lot of talk about it, and I tried to divorce myself from the talk about it, and I prefer to divorce myself from it now. I served just as part of my regular routine work. And I still would if I were appointed, well, up until the time I took complete retirement, which was 2 or 3 weeks ago.
At the time that you inherited the prison case, some of the state prisons were overcrowded.
Yes, sir, they certainly were.
Okay.
And they still are.
And you had entered an order that problem needed to be fixed.
Yes, sir.
And it didn't get fixed, as I have studied.
It is not normally fixed by the judge, and it is preferred that it not be fixed by the judge. It's somebody else's business. It's a legislative issue. And in this situation, it would normally have been left up to the state legislative services. It was a very distasteful position to be put into if you were running for office. And but it was a position that a federal judge should not have been in. And I think maybe the federal judge that finally did something about it did it from necessity, because it wasn't done by the people that should have done it.
Talk about one other case, somewhat related to the prison case that you just had, that I think cert was denied by the United States Supreme Court, and that was some litigation brought by prisoners that were HIV positive.
Yes, sir.
Talk a little bit about that case.
Like I say, it was a matter that was handled through the state legislature. And I suppose the first case that was ever handled through the federal system might have been this case. I'm not sure.
And by way of background, the state, through the Department of Corrections, was segregating HIV positive inmates from the general population of inmates.
Yes.
And a lawsuit was brought challenging the constitutionality on behalf of the HIV positive patients in terms of them being segregated and not allegedly having the same rights as other prisoners in the general population.
You, of course, helped me express that very well. I hadn't thought much about it in a good while.
And you were ultimately affirmed by the 11th Circuit
I was.
in ruling that you could
and
segregate.
I think the Supreme Court finally affirmed it, did they not?
They denied cert, so it was final.
Now that's the Supreme Court of the United States.
Yes, sir. Judge, talk a little bit, just in general terms, about what your judicial philosophy has been through the years, in terms of what your role as a judge is and how you think cases ought to be efficiently handled and managed.
My position is that a judge ought not to set that up. The legislature sets it up, and judges ought to keep that conversation to themselves about how they think it ought to be done. And that's been my position generally. And I try to keep it a private matter as to me.
qualities do you think people should look for in judges today and obviously in the future? What do you think some of the important qualities are to make a good judge?
Well, I think that I have expressed myself pretty well on the whole subject. A judge ought to be reasonably quiet about what he does, what he ought to do until he has to do it. And I've tried to stick to that.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time to tell us about your life.